everybody, and welcome to Horror 101 with Dr. AC. Today, we're going to be tackling one of the most notorious films in history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, which is celebrating its 49th anniversary, because why not celebrate the 49th anniversary? It came out in 1974. There are several new releases that are coming out, and to talk to me about them are my pals, Scott Bradley from Hellbent for Horror, Aaron AuBuchon from Discover the Horror, and John Kitley, also of Discover the Horror and Kitley's Krypt. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hey, so I suppose we have to talk about this movie.
I never talk about this. I mean, nobody really covered this yet, so
no, it's really not much to say, really. I mean, it's
pretty obscure.
One and done. It was released, and I thought it was fun that the film's events of this true crime event took place August 17th, 1973. So we are technically celebrating a 50th anniversary of the events in the film. But as we all know, it was one of those that it pretended to be a true story that it was not. Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, I listened to the Toby Hooper audio commentary, where it's just him and David Gregory, who did the documentary Shocking Truth, who's also in charge of Severin Films. And Hooper talks about how, we put this in here to give you the idea that maybe it was true. He goes, but there wasn't anything that was there. It may have been like there was weird stuff in the air at the time. There was like a taxidermy murder that happened in Austin, but I think that happened before the movie. I think it happened after the movie, but people told me it was before. So he wanted to try and give you the idea that what you're seeing is involved with something, but it wasn't truly based on things like how people talk about Ed Gein a lot. Right. He had a couple Wisconsin relatives who came to visit him, but he was like 3 or 4 when he heard the stories of lampshades and stuff like that. So he said, I didn't intentionally have that, but when I came up with the idea of the story in my own way, this kind of creeped in. So it did kind of bring it to that whole deal. So it's one of those things where I think it has more in common with like the old TV show FBI or Dragnet, where they would sit there and go, these are stories based on the streets of LA and stuff like that. It had that kind of thing where an authority figure with an authoritative voice tells you something's real and you go, oh, this must be real. This elevates this already. And I think he was kind of playing on that old school style more than like the sensationalized based on a true story thing that happens just a few years later.
Yeah. John, where did you encounter this film for the first time?
The very first time was when I worked at the theater. We had it on a re-release, so you're talking mid 80s. So when my first viewing, I was very disappointed because there's only one chainsaw murder, and that's not really qualifying as a massacre. So I was looking for something over the top gore, and because of the title. But upon repeat viewings, you start to see where the charm is and how effective it is. And it's one of those films that I've seen many times in the theater since then. And no matter how many times you see this, when you see it, especially in a theater, it never fails to have that same literally terrifying impact, because especially the last half hour is something like you will never see again, I think, in a cinematic presentation.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's funny that John's story is somewhat similar to my own. I rented this film when I always say I was 8, but I think I was 10. And my grandma, I had this weird situation when I was growing up where I had these hyper protective parents about my ability to go anywhere. So I couldn't even, like, the farthest I could go from my house, we lived in the middle of a block, and I could go to the corner. That was it until I was like 12 years old or something like that. It's crazy. When I was 6, I wasn't allowed to ride in a car until I was old enough to drive in one unless my parents were operating it. But I could watch and listen to anything I wanted to. So it meant that I was home constantly and watching tremendously fucked up cinema, so consequently my grandparents were willing to rent this stuff for me, and much like John, I'd heard so much about the film. I was already sort of reading about horror at this point, and it had this legend in my mind, and I watched it and I was supremely disappointed. And I would say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to me is one of the most important horror films for me, one of the most important films, one of the most important pieces of art in my life, because it was the first one. So for years I told people, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, man, all through high school I was like, whatever, it's not scary, it's not interesting, whatever. And then I watched it again after being goaded into it by some friends when I was 18. And I was like, oh my God, this movie is terrifying. I just wasn't old or mature enough to understand it. And so consequently, this is the first film that taught me that revisiting a thing later in your life is so valuable and so important. And, whenever I talk to fans of cinema and they're like, I don't like that movie, and they refuse to rewatch it, I think you are missing out on a really important part of your development as a human being. And for me, that was what the Texas Chainsaw Massacre did.
Yeah, it is the old adage of you can't step in the same river twice. I mean, you can't. And Texas Chainsaw, and I'll get to you in a second, Scott, but Texas Chainsaw is one of those films that I think it does change for you as you get older. And for me, watching it initially, my second viewing and my third viewing, they're not the same viewings at all. Like, I think I went into seeing Texas Chainsaw it's almost like the title itself is a dare, and you're like, right, okay, I'm ready. Give me your worst. And again, it's not the worst. It's not the goriest film you've ever seen. Like it's going to be one of those things you're like, I'm ready for the worst. And you go, okay, well, that wasn't so bad. And if it's not so bad, then you're like, well, that sucked. But then coming back around to it, it's like, okay, I appreciate it on a completely different level now. And as John was saying, that sustained tension, the 84 minutes that it takes to get from A to B is like, this thing moves. And the last half hour is relentless. It just keeps on going. And that's the thing, like, it doesn't have peaks and valleys like it does for the first half. Like you get into and it's like, nope, it's all downhill and you're going to die. Scott.
Oh yeah. So it's interesting that you say that about the 84 minutes and stuff, how small this movie is when you really start to take a look at it. Like, it's just a couple rooms and a backyard and a van. And it's amazing the power it has. But the first time that I saw it, I mean, it's so funny listening to everybody, the first time I saw it, I hated it. First time I saw it, I hated it. So many of the movies that I absolutely love now, the first time I saw them, it's like, fuck, that was terrible. I mean, that happens to me a lot. It's kind of like when I can't stand her. I can't, how do you like her? I can't, and then you marry her, and it's that kind of weird thing. It's like this weird, like, what is it about this grating? And then it's like this really exciting thing. And for me, Chainsaw, it was like I saw it before I saw it. I was just on a show and I was talking about how it was at a drive-in in my hometown, and it was on the one screen that you could see going down this major route through the valley. And so it had Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the first time I saw any ads for it was the one sheet that they did where it was her body hanging on the meat hook, but they turn it sideways, the chainsaw over it. So it looks like she's actually getting carved. And I saw that and I'm like, my eyes are huge. My dad's like, well, can't go down Route 309 for a week until that fucking movie's over. So that was on our show, terrified. By the way. Okay.
You were on Discover the Horror whenever you said that.
That was wonderful. It was a great show, by the way. Thank you for having me on.
It's so meta in this room. I can barely stand it.
But I didn't say, and those guys were assholes, but that's the real meta part. But so I didn't get to see it for the longest time. Scaredy Cat, all that stuff. I got to see it in the 80s, like John said, on VHS. First time I got to see it was when the media thing came out with a really cool cover with Rex Reed saying this is the most terrifying movie ever made. And I'm sitting with my friends, my teenage friends, and we're watching it, and we're just like slack-jawed watching this thing going, what the fuck? Because it's like the hitchhiker is like somebody we could have met downtown, and it feels like what the fuck? This is like a Looney Tunes. People are like chasing each other. They're sliding when they're running. They're screaming. They're jumping up and down. I was like going, this isn't scary. This is like vaudeville. I don't know what the fuck I'm watching. And we're like giggling about the whole thing. Like, this is terrible. I don't know why anybody thought this was scary until two things. I remember I got a lump in my throat the first time I heard the generator. Well, you just heard the brum, 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 and they're walking towards the house. It's just a fuel generator, but you don't know it because the name Texas Chainsaw Massacre is echoing in the back around already. So I'm already going, well, that's a chainsaw. They're about to get turned into meatloaf. And it doesn't happen. And I remember how scared I was just seeing this fucking thing. And then that prolonged end. But the real scare happens when it just shuts off. When she's getting driven away, covered in blood, screaming, laughing, and Leatherface is doing this chainsaw twirl. The second that movie ended, I felt that fear, and I had to watch it again. It was like that was the moment. It was like that whole 84 minutes went for that one scene with him going with that chainsaw and her screaming, and I was like, I got to see this fucking thing again. I was just laughing my ass off over them running around a truck. You know, the trucker comes out to try and help the damsel, and then he comes running around in the opposite direction. The guy chasing with a chainsaw is right out of a Warner Brothers cartoon. And then you have this incredibly scary thing that happens at the end. And so I hated it when I first saw it. Same thing happened with Night of the Living Dead. I thought, oh, Jesus. But the end of that movie galvanized me and made me want to watch it again. So, yeah, it's funny that most of us, it was a movie that is so unique, so different than anything else that you could have possibly seen, so against the rules of what we expect out of genre, that your first instinct is to say, yeah, no, I don't like this. It's not following. I come to movies to be surprised, and yet this movie's surprising me too much, and I don't like it. And so you have to come back to it, you know?
And my introduction to it was actually as part of a clip show that Elvira put together called Film Gore. And it had things like 2000 Maniacs and Blood Feast and Snuff and Driller Killer. And then there was these scenes from Texas Chainsaw. So kind of like what you were saying, Scott, like I saw it before seeing it, in that I like had seen all the good parts. And so when I saw the movie itself, I'm kind of like, okay, there isn't anything more to it, you know, in terms of good parts. Like all the good parts I've seen already. And as an adult, I'm watching it and going, the good parts are actually the other parts. The good parts are the spending, you know, Pam falling into that room and us spending an inordinate amount of time looking around. I was like it hadn't, watching it this most recent time, it hadn't struck me like how like elongated that time becomes. Like she just is, you know, like we go into a different realm. We're not watching this in real time anymore. Like we are lovingly looking at all of Robert Burns's production design, and it just, that moment itself stretches out. And that really struck me this time, that this is a film about like the elasticity of time. Like that running through the forest takes forever. And yet it's very short. It's like, you know, like 30 seconds of screen time, but it takes forever. Yeah. And that really struck me this time. And I think that's credit to Sally Richardson and Larry Carroll, our editors. Also, Tobe Hooper was very much instrumental in that as well. Let's talk a little bit about Tobe Hooper, because this was his second feature film. The first film being Eggshells, which is very much an art house piece. And this was something he was looking to have some commercial value to it. So, I mean, he was angling for a commercial audience. Anybody want to kick that off?
Well, I'd like to real quick, just before we leave this concept, unpack a little bit of that, because what you just said, I think, is so important. And I think it bears mentioning for folks who are just sort of finding their way into Texas Chainsaw and haven't read a lot about it. But that concept of compressing and elongating time, it also relates back to how brilliantly this story is told visually. That whole sequence that you talk about there, beginning from Terry McMinn, that's her name, McMinn, right? Where she's on the swing all the way into the house through that whole bit, is so brilliantly placed, because we have just met Leatherface for the first time. That's this immense shock. It's boom, it's over. They even slam a door shut on it to kind of make the point. And then that brilliant shot, and I don't know if you've got a section to talk about that shot, but one of the most brilliant shots in all of horror, from underneath the swing as Terry stands up and we walk towards the house, and the house just gets bigger and bigger and engulfs her. And then she goes inside, and we spend all that time in there. And then later, the same thing happens whenever we're in the house at the end of the dinner scene, and Marilyn Burns breaks out of the window, and it's daytime. And we cut to her face, and she's completely befuddled, because we feel it too. We're like, oh my God, we've been in this horror show for that last half an hour, as you've mentioned, several of you have talked about, that last half an hour lasts for about 3 days. It feels really long, and you're like, oh God, but at the same time, you're like, it's not nighttime anymore. So there's a genius to the way that they play with time here. And I think, Scott, you mentioned too, how small this movie is. That's the other thing, it's all inside this house. Like, after that shot from the swing, we're being drawn back to the gravity of the house over and over again until we just can't escape it.
Yeah, I do want to talk really quick about that swing moment, because I'd listened to the commentaries, and like the idea of the house filling the frame. What's interesting is that because you've got Terry McMinn's red short shorts, and we're following those visually, we're following those. And so the house kind of sneaks up on you. It's only after you've watched it a few times that you start to notice that the house is rising up into the frame. But when you're initially watching it, you're just watching those short shorts go toward the house, and you're emotionally thinking, don't go in the house, don't go in the house. There's bad things in there. And then you recognize, oh, like, we have been drawn, the house has enveloped us. And I thought that was kind of incredible. And I'd never really thought about it until just as I was watching it, because it was like, I've always just watched those short shorts, and then suddenly I'm up on that damn porch where I don't want to be.
I learned something new about the film this time watching the Hooper commentary, because he says it's so important because we see her back here. And I was like, oh my God, it's Chekhov's back, because so much is made of her getting hung on that meat hook, and we don't see it, but everybody thinks that they do. We have this whole sequence where we're not just following the shorts, you're right, but we're seeing the full expanse of her naked back. Right. And then we see her get hung on that meat hook later, and we can feel it because we intimately know what that back looks like. Sorry, John.
Yeah. And we had that. Go ahead, John, because I gotta.
No, I was just gonna say, I love the fact that as we're following that shot, as she's walking towards the house, then the camera stops, saying, "Fuck that! I am not going in that house. Have fun, because I've seen what is in there. I'm stopping here." So it's almost like we're following her. We're her character, but then at some point we stop, going, "Nope, go ahead."
And I'll bounce to you just a second, Scott, because. Like as Aaron was saying, that door shutting. It's amazing, because we've seen. I think a lot of us have seen that clip many, many, many times, and so it's almost like we have gotten very familiar with the appearance of Leatherface for the first time. But the first appearance is so short; it's so brief. We see him in a long shot, then we get that brief pan up, and then we see the hammer come down, and then we see him from a long shot again, throwing Kirk off the way, and it's like. Wait, what just happened there? And he shuts the door, and it's like, wait, what just happened? Like, what just happened? Scott?
Yeah, it's the shock of the shark in Jaws is kind of how I look at how Leatherface shows up. It's almost subliminal. You're like, did I just see? It's so long on that hallway, right? We hear this kind of weird animal noise, which turns Kurt around, and he's like walking towards there. And we have this shot where he looks, and we have the reverse, and it's a shot of the hallway with this red, right? Once again, red pants, red wall. And then it goes closer in to just the bones and everything, but the red's still there, not seeing this character that's behind there. So we have this really long, extended moment of where we hear this noise and time is elongated, stretched there. And then it's almost like a rubber band. He's walking. And as soon as he trips, snap, he lets go of the rubber band. Boom, what? Falls, looks up, whap, spins, kick, bam, 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 pick up, wham, boom. Weird fucking music. And that's one of the things that Hooper talked about a lot in his in his ideas on horror is that everything's a little nasty, like everything's a harmonic in music. You put one nasty on top of another nasty, like going to that abandoned house, and then there's all these daddy long leg spiders in a corner, and they just found that and said, oh, we're shooting that. That's going to go in the fucking movie. And it's another nasty on top of each other until you get this thing that really freaks you out. And so that scene is so exquisitely done in that way. And I'm probably going to be the Hooper champion in this room because he always gets shit on. And it's funny how much, you know, we can have a room full of people at a convention who will sit there and talk about Steckler. They'll talk about Michaels. They'll talk about all these guys who have these movies that, hey, there's something to be found inside of them. That's really great. And they'll talk about these guys in reverence. And then they talk about Hooper and like, fucking one movie, man. One movie and out that fucking guy. And it's like, shit, are you kidding me? You can't find the nuggets in this weird, surrealist, absurdist guy. And before I came on here, you asked about talking about Hooper a little bit. I listened to Postmortem again. Before Hooper died, about 3 months before he died, he was on Mick Garris's Postmortem. And so they've known each other forever. And Garris just throws him a softball. He goes, you know, sometimes movies are just like recorded dreams. Do you have dreams? And it's like any other filmmaker is going to come on and go, oh, yes, well, there's the similarity of the waking dream and the film. And my movies are twisting some of these nightmares and finding the culture. You know, they do that. And Hooper goes, yeah, I have these nightmares. I have bad nightmares. They're just terrible. And then he goes, but I guess they kind of make the way in the movies. But, you know, I had a dream the other night that I invented this purple goo. And this purple goo, you rolled it up and you put it in your ear. And it gave you the daily dose of horror that you needed. And Garris is like, yeah, just jaw drop, like, what the fuck are you talking about, Toby? And I think that's the thing about Tobe Hooper is that he was on a different wavelength. He made these movies and he struck gold with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But he's always been like almost like a child or almost like someone who's neurodivergent in a weird way, that his art, he doesn't know how to articulate verbally. It's visual stuff. You know, they would talk to like Finley, and Finley would say, yeah, I was in a couple of his movies, and he wouldn't come up to you and say, here's your motivation. He'd give you hand signals. He'd go, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Or he would go like right before they're ready to roll the camera and Eaten Alive, he'd come up and go, I think this guy might be mentally ill. And he'd walk away, and it's like right before it's rolling, it's like, so that's my motivation. So, you know, he was just that way, controlled chaos, weirdness, inarticulate in some ways. And yet there was this real weird poetry that's almost childlike. If it was David Lynch, people would be praising him at the height from all the highest places. Like, wow, look at what he does with surreality. But it's this weird, grumbling Texas dope. You know, and all of a sudden, you know, everybody second guesses that strangeness that he's got.
I think it does. I think, and I agree that that he is operating in a different way. And I think part of it is that he doesn't tip his hand of surrealism in his other films the way he does with this one. Like, he really leans into it. I mean, with the close-ups of Marilyn Burns' eyes and that compression of time. You know, like, I think this does feel like a nightmare. It does feel like a dream. And I feel like Eaten Alive has a similar tone to it. And I don't know that we ever kind of go back to that again. Whereas Lynch, you kind of see recurring themes and recurring stylistic choices. And I think had he continued to make Texas Chainsaw over and over again, we would be criticizing him for making Texas Chainsaw over and over again.
Right.
But I also don't feel like he ever tapped back into that in the same way, where he leaned into the surrealism as hard as he did here.
I think he also deals in an ugliness. Like, David Lynch has a certain streamlined Art Deco 40s to 60s kind of style that looks hip and cool and it looks very good on camera. But here, I mean, everything that's in a Hooper film is, people got like birthmarks. They're loud. They're smelly looking, you know, everything about them. It's very trailer parky in the America that he's taking a look at. And he's attacking, and very meat oriented. Weirdly enough, it's like, and mouth oriented. Like I think it's the wettest mouth movie ever. Is how I talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everything's lip smacks, things hanging out of people's mouths. Everybody's talking like this at certain points if they're fucking weird. It's just yeah, his shit is fucked. and I kind of adore it.
I do want to, I'd like to, if anybody has anything they want to throw in now, because the next thing I want you to be thinking about on this most recent viewing, was there a moment that kind of spoke to you in a different way than you had in the past? I know I had a couple this time where I was like, oh, hang on, I that moment means something different to me, or it's highlighted in a way I hadn't thought about it before. But if Aaron, it looks like you had something you wanted to toss in.
Yeah, a couple of things about Hooper, I think, that I wanted to talk about a little bit. One of them is the fact that there's this interesting dichotomy when you hear people talk about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in particular, because it's legendary, if anybody out there hasn't sort of dove into this, for having been a very difficult set, a challenging, grueling set, where it is astonishing that no one was crippled, paralyzed, murdered, that nobody got hurt or killed in a really pretty visceral way. So there was a lot of what feels like abuse on this set. Notoriously, Toby Hooper didn't make this film by himself, right? He made it with Kim Henkel, the writer and co-producer, right next to him for the whole thing. And if you listen to anyone in the cast talk about it, it was always Toby and Kim this, Toby and Kim that. And so they were collaborating, but there was also this undercurrent of them constantly chuckling through when other people are miserable, like really enjoying their misery, right? So there's that piece of it. And you start to kind of not like Toby Hooper and Kim Henkel a little bit after you listen to this stuff. And yet, if you listen to them, nobody ever, and all the financial issues that came later, often because of what Toby Hooper did to get the film finished, nobody ever comes out and says, that bastard. Nobody ever calls him out. And so I think there's something really interesting there. People voice their concerns with him. He was bad with actors. He didn't know how to direct actors. Like you said, Scott, he's just like, I don't know. He's got a shirt on. Go, like, there's your direction. But nobody seemed to think that he was in it for the wrong reasons. And they all say the same thing. All that misery I felt, all that shit that I went through, it's on the screen. And it all got up there. So there's that. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that notoriously this film was one where Hooper was not interested in listening to production. So when the producers would come around and say, you have to make shot lists, you have to do it this way, he would be like, okay. And then, Daniel Pearl tells a story about like he'd get to set and he'd start setting up the shots that Toby sent him. And Toby'd get there and be like, what are you doing? We're going to do this. And he was like, well, I was setting up the shots. And he was like, yeah, we're just doing that because they told us we had to. We're just going to figure it out as we go. Notoriously, or not notoriously, but obviously as Hooper's career continued, he started to move closer and closer to the Hollywood system. Hollywood won't let you do that very much, especially if you're kind of a director who's being tested. So the brilliance of the moment we just talked about, the great moment, the Dolly moment, Daniel Pearl and Tobe Hooper had to threaten to quit to be able to do that shot, because eventually they locked him down and said, look, you're going to make a shot list because we're way over budget. And they said, you're not going to do this shot because Daniel Pearl came up with it the night before. And they said, this is too important. We got to get this shot. So my point is that one of the reasons that Hooper's career might not have been as stellar as it could have been, to your point, Scott, is that if he is a surrealist, he comes up with stuff in the moment and he has to explore those things. And he might have really not been given the opportunity for that exploration very often on big budget Hollywood movies.
Right. No, that totally makes sense, Aaron, because I mean, I feel like my memory of it is that Daniel Pearl actually came up with that shot that day. Like he was like, hang on, while we're here, I can do this. And you have to have the freedom to explore in your own organic way. And, as Scott was saying, like, I think Tobe Hooper was operating in a more instinctual way. And if he's not allowed the opportunity to explore those instincts in the moment, if he's trapped into, well, we built this set and we've got these lights hung, we got to do this shot this way because that's what we're doing today. And we got all these people standing around. Like Toby's not going to be able to be like, yeah, but I got an idea over here. So I thought we'd just shoot this daddy long legs.
Right.
So John, did you have a moment that kind of jumped out at you this most recent viewing?
Not necessarily on the most recent one, other than the fact that it just how damn effective it still is. But honestly, the thing that really changed the arc for me is, which is odd, it's 20 years ago next year. The first April Cinema Wasteland show, they had a reunion, and they had all the remaining cast, literally the entire cast, including Paul Partain. The only one that wasn't there was Jim Seidel, who had passed away. But the stories that came out then, that what Toby Hooper had told Paul Partain to stay in character all the time, to the point where the entire cast hated him. Yeah. So when you watch the film, and this isn't to take away from anybody's acting ability, but you see the hatred that these characters have for Franklin. And then once you realize that's not acting that much as they really disliked that character. And even
they didn't dislike the character, even they disliked the man. They didn't know that there was a difference, right?
Yeah. And even Gunnar Hansen had said he could not wait to kill Franklin, even though he doesn't have really hardly any interaction with him. But even off camera during breaks, he was still in character and he was whining all the time. So now when you watch the film, you see these little elements, like when Sally is pushing Franklin in the weeds, where she is in agony because of this fucking guy. But then it's like, oh my God, that is really her feeling that way. So every time I watch it now, that seeps into my viewing when you watch the characters. So, because I think that's almost as important as, the horror and the chainsaw and all the other stuff going on. It's the character interaction. When they go visit their grandpa's house and Franklin's down there by himself and they're like, yeah, fuck it, whatever. And they're laughing and having a great time. And he's down there pissed off and whining and everything. You get that sense of these characters a lot more defined than I thought of previously having that knowledge.
I would be, I'm going to be that guy who goes to the mat and says, I don't think Franklin is that annoying. I think Franklin for me is a sympathetic character because he's somebody who is along on this trip and he's surrounded by, abled people. Everybody is paired up, not him.
Yeah.
He's hot. He's uncomfortable. His entire life is one of discomfort. And, like they get it, this first chance they get to abandon him, they abandon him. And even Sally wants to abandon. And so he's like, no, you don't get the flashlight. You don't get to leave. Like, because everybody's trying to shed Franklin. It's like, Franklin has had it rough, folks. And like, again,
he has to piss in a Maxwell House cup or whatever.
I get that he's annoying, but I never feel like this guy doesn't deserve my sympathies.
No. And they convinced him to come along too. I mean, according to his own, he's like, oh, come along, Franklin, it'll be fun.
Yeah, right.
I think John hits on a really interesting moment too. That thing of being down in Grandpa's house. Just the idea that it's so run down and everything. This is Grandpa's house, right? And they're upstairs and they have that sound design where the voices are really kind of far away. It's just close enough to realize people are having fun. You can't really articulate what's being said. And he's vulnerable at that moment. It's interesting. There are a couple of things that are kind of mirrors back. And that's one of them where he's sitting there and he looks up and there's those bones and feathers hanging from a string. And at that moment, he could get killed at any second. We suddenly realize that there's some danger.
Someone's been visiting Grandpa's house.
Yeah, somebody's been here. And it's not something that's it's like Blair Witch, there's these sticks hanging in the tree and it's, why is that scary? Well, it is or it isn't. And if contextually in the right context, that string hanging down was really threatening to me when I watched that thing with Franklin. So I like your defense of Franklin as well. Although I have to say, when he can't shut the fuck up in the van, he just keeps going chuk, 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 and all that shit. I'm like, man, that's a long trip.
Yeah. I'd like to comment quickly on a couple of things here, because I think that, first of all, to what you said, John, I think that, Toby Hooper wins the Billy Friedkin Award for torturing his actors a little bit, because, it's notorious. And not only did he do the things that you talked about, but he also was going around behind Paul Partain and Marilyn Burns's backs, respectively, and saying to the other one, "Hey, I heard Marilyn was talking about you and said this," and "Hey, I heard that Paul said this about you." Like, what a crazy thing to do to your, it's like to not trust your actors enough to carry the day,
right? To actually act.
But at the same time, it worked. And the other thing I'd like to say to what you said, Scott, I've always thought that the design of that house is so critical to the overarching sort of themes in the film, because how old do you think Sally is in this movie? 22, maybe?
Maybe. Yeah.
And she says, "This was my room when I was a kid." So what, a decade ago? How did this house go from home to ruin in a decade, or less? So this whole concept of the film as the de-evolution of America unraveling, which is what I see it as being sort of this big, large, overarching metaphor for
apocalypse.
To me, that house is right there. That's important. Like, how did this place become, a bunch of sticks and spider infestations and floorboards at weird angles and walls missing in a decade? How did that happen, or less?
Well, here's a fun, because this jumped out at me this time. They call it the old Franklin place. And I'm like, wait, is he like Franklin?
Is he Franklin?
Because he talks about his dad. It says it's his dad's place. And I'm like, wait, are you Franklin? Like, no wonder you're all messed up.
That is hilarious. I never even thought of that. There are a couple things that really stuck out for me this time. I think because, of course, I'm watching the 4K, and this is Dark Sky's version, right?
Yep.
I just want to make sure, because
I'll do a big kind of like, here we are with the supplements, because it is an amazing release from Dark Sky. But yeah, go ahead and talk to your
one of the things is that what's the big thing you always hear? The ballyhoo around this film is reverse ballyhoo. Everybody wants to sit and go like this. It's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's maybe a cup of blood in it. Horse shit. There's blood all over the place, but it's not what we expect when we hear Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We're never in a body cavity. We don't see amputations. We don't see spurt, but there's blood from the moment we see the first image is these two corpses that are stuck on a grave. And how many years I've been watching this movie until this 4K, I never saw the drip of viscera going down the teeth of the skull. And so from the very beginning, we've got moist meat, rotted claw, which we would consider gore in any other kind of film. But this one, we're forgetting that moment. There's blood of the cutting of the hand. There's blood of the cutting of the arm. There's blood smeared on the van. There's dried blood all over the house. And you really see it when you're seeing this in 4K. Yes, we don't see blood gushing out of anybody. But Sally spends the last 20 minutes of the movie essentially coated in blood. When she's running down the street, she looks like a caramel apple. And we've got a guy chasing her with a straight edge, slashing her in the back. Yes, we don't see the meat unflaying itself, but she is constantly getting hit. I mean, there's violence through this movie. There's meat and there's blood all over it. And it cracks me up, because I was one of the people who said, there's so little blood. But if you really look, it's just what our expectations are with that name.
I want to throw the ball to you, Aaron, after this. The cemetery, the opening in the cemetery, which is so iconic.
So good.
It struck me for the first time this time that our hitchhiker is the one who creates all of the art.
Yeah,
because he's the one who broke into the cemetery. He's the one that created that weird sculpture. So that whole house is because of what the hitchhiker does. The hitchhiker's the one fooling around and making the artwork, because who else is making it? We kind of just take it for granted that, hey, this is a weird house and there's weird stuff. But it's like, no, it's the hitchhiker, because Jim Seidel is like, I told you to stay out of that cemetery. It's like,
right.
He got into the cemetery and he built that crazy sculpture because he just can't help himself. And he steals like hands and things like that. He's not stealing them for food. He's stealing them for his artwork, which I was
artist.
Like, why didn't I? Yeah. I never ever saw that before. So, Aaron, back to you. What's like a moment that jumped out at you this time?
I think I already said it, and it was thanks to the commentary with Toby Hooper and Daniel Pearl, and I forget who else was in that one. But when Hooper just sort of offhandedly said, "Oh, it's so important because you can see your back," and I thought, "Oh my God, how?" And I don't know if it's always on purpose in this film. I think a lot of what works in this film ended up being happy accidents. Although Daniel Pearls has said that, the way that he explained the setup of that iconic dolly shot was, I want the house to get bigger and bigger. Like he already knew, it's one thing to just say, I want this cool tracking shot that looks at this girl's butt. That's a reason to do it. And you can see why you would do it that way, especially, I mean, Toby Hooper was like the oldest guy on the set at 28, like everybody was in their, early to mid 20s. And so it's like, they're having fun in a way. But the fact that, that sequence leads itself so well to everything that comes after it. And, to kind of speak to what Scott just said a little bit, I think that every time I watch this film, I tack on a new apocalyptic piece of content. And I don't think that I had ever thought much about what the sunspots suggest before. But, I was reading Joseph Lanza's book about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a weird little bit of hopscotch that goes all over American culture every 3 paragraphs somehow. Like somehow you're like, it's glam rock for a paragraph, and then the space program, and then back to Texas Chainsaw. And you're like, I don't even know. Your neck is hurting because you get you got whiplash from going from place to place. But he made a point that I thought was kind of interesting. In 1972, we had our last manned space mission, and there was a problem with sunspots impacting that particular voyage. And in a kind of way, it harkens back to the fact that, just 4 years before that, we sent the first person to space, and it was the most watched thing on television, and the entire country was, it was like this moment where everybody put their differences aside and was looking forward. And 4 years later, they didn't even broadcast that trip. It was just like it got talked about on the news. And the sunspots almost draw this back to like just how quickly it felt like, I feel like our culture was unraveling on some levels, and how fast we were, going in a divide. And I wrote an article years ago about the city country divide between the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I Drink Your Blood. So I've always seen that, but every time I watch it, I see something new. And like I said, this time the sunspots, I was like, the sunspots made me kind of go all the way back around to, again, the idea that there is nothing here that doesn't suggest that everything is bad and then the wheels have come off the wagon.
Yeah, that's Hooper talks about that. He mentioned in his audio commentary with David that the solar flares. He said, I don't know. He goes, we did that because solar flares and that whole Mercury in retrograde. It's all about interfering with communication. We're no longer talking. Talking is hard, and so I thought that was really interesting because when he's asked what the movie's about by David Gregory, he goes, "It's about a bad day." Everybody has a bad day. Leatherface has a bad day. And so I think that's fucking awesome. That's him. And Aaron, you said something interesting, which is something that always sticks in my craw when I hear people use it in a dismissive fashion, which is they didn't try to make anything like that. That's shit just happened. And he lived on that kind of thing. Hooper was like, no, some of the best things just happen. You get in there. Like he thought that the heat, that they didn't plan to go in there in June and shoot. That was when the money came. And so they're there. He goes, but he looked at it. He goes, that was kind of a gift. He goes, that, everybody getting angry and stuff. That was kind of a gift to the movie. He goes, because we started doing like a war dance, some kind of energy came out of all of that. And it showed itself in the movie. And I thought that was really interesting to me that he would go down. He looked at it all like he was hated. He goes, they all hated me, but that's all right. Because it's on the screen. He goes, one of the saddest things is him saying, one of the weirdest things is that he goes, at the end of the movie, there were 3 wrap parties. There was a wrap party for the family. There was a wrap party for the kids. And then there was just me. And, the idea that you've made this thing and no matter what, everybody still just fucking hates you and you're in the corner. But what really hit me was, there were wrap parties for this fucking thing. Like I thought the wrap party was her getting on the back of the fucking Ford and driving away. That's the wrap party as far as I'm concerned. I can't even think of people sitting around sipping a beer after making that fucking movie.
Right.
I love the story about Lou Perryman in Gunnar Hansen's book. Lou Perryman apparently at the end of this sequence. So Lou Perryman was the first AC. That's the focus puller, right? That's the guy who stands in front of the camera and pulls the focus. And that means that for all those Leatherface scenes, he was the guy closest to the notoriously unbearably smelly Gunnar Hansen. And so he was pretty pissed off, and he was good friends with Toby Hooper, but he also famously was kind of a loudmouth. Fans may know him as LG from Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, but he was standing there ranting to a bunch of people who would listen. That bastard did this to us, and they did this to us, and Toby happened to walk through at that point, so apparently Perryman just turned around and was like, he was the one, and jumped on it, and they wrestled around for a while, and then eventually they got up and they were all okay. But the hatred was visceral enough that one of the members of the crew attacked the director on set.
Yep. I do want, I mean, we could, and we probably will in the future, continue to talk about this film itself, but I do want to talk about this package that Dark Sky has put out, because it's pretty incredible. There have been numerous releases of Texas Chainsaw over the years, this is that 4K restoration that Scott was referring to. It's got 4 commentary tracks on the first disc, the UHD release. And I'll just quickly run through those. You got one from Hooper, Hansen, and Daniel Pearl from the '96 Laserdisc. Then the second one from like the 90s with the cast, Robert Burns and Paul Partain, Alan Dansger, and Robert Burns. And then we had the solo commentary by Tobe Hooper from 2014. And then you have the final one also from 2014, which was with Daniel Pearl, Larry Carroll, and Ted Nicolau, who would go on and work with Charles Band, several of his films, but he was the sound recording. So, there's 4 fantastic commentary tracks. And then there are like 3 documentaries, one of which is new. And then there's the 2 that were referred to before, the Shocking Truth and the Flesh Wounds one that Felsher made. And there's also this great conversation between William Friedkin, and Tobe Hooper. And that was for the 40th anniversary release.
The Abuse Brothers.
Exactly. I was just like, man, and like back to like 73, 74. It's like, great. I could totally see them being like, kinship. You like torturing people too? Awesome. Me too.
And making the most important horror movies of their era and maybe of all times.
Yeah. And I just love how those 2 guys couldn't be any different in like personality, right? And yet they both found this connection through horror. Yeah, for sure. Anything you guys want to just this floor is open if anyone want to talk about any of the specific featurettes and things like that, things that you particularly enjoyed about this release?
I will just say that if you're a fan of this movie and are thinking not to get the 4K because you're going to think that it looks like it was just filmed, that is not the case. It still has the grain. It still looks like it always has. I mean, it looks better, but it's not going to be a brand new, crisp, clean release like a lot of 4Ks are. So don't fret over that. It's still worth getting.
Doesn't lose its texture. I mean,
right. You'll still sweat while you're watching
it. Yeah. I was especially fond of the new documentary. I think that it's so great, that we've reached a point. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I watched it. I watched it as soon as I got the disc, whatever that was, a week and a half ago. And but I don't think there's anybody from the original film that's involved with talking about it.
Right. I think it's, and I think it's less of a documentary and more of kind of like an appreciation by critics and filmmakers and people who are influenced and who have kind of thrilled to it over the years. It's less about kind of like the nuts and bolts of it and more just people's response, kind of similar to what we're doing here.
Well, and that's what I think is so important to realize. And this has been true for a long time with this film. But I think that there's a couple of ways to view a piece of art, especially a piece of cinematic art, which is popular art. And one of them is the way that the filmmakers, whoever they were, whether it's the actors, the director, the cinematographer, the editor, viewed what the thing that they were making was at the time. Then there's individual responses to it. And then there's the culturally sort of accepted response to it, which are different animals a little bit. And I think that these documentaries show, because I would still say it documents something about what has happened to our culture as a result of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Because I honestly believe that without the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, our culture, I mean, not gigantically, but not just the horror culture, but our culture in America would be different. without the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's
Oh,
something about that
absolutely.
film that crawled under the Americans' sort of skin and has stayed there ever since. And so to get this kind of documentary that is itself an appreciation, but that recognizes the impact that the film has had, I thought that was great. It was nice to see something like that. I thought, you know, like, let's get some big minds in here and really talk about what matters about this thing.
For sure. I like the talking to Ron Bozeman, who's the production manager on
Yeah.
this, and who
Mhm.
later went on to, you know, like win an Oscar for Silence of the Lambs. You know, like kind of his, that's the first time I've heard kind of like definitive numbers, because he has, you know, he has the records. And so he's like, this is how things broke out. Because there's the famous, you know, distribution nightmare where Bryanston Films picked this up, and Bryanston was, you know, famously connected to the mob. And so the filmmakers and the actors and nobody got the money that they probably should have gotten. And he was there to kind of, it was the first time I've heard somebody really kind of nuts and bolts it out for me, like how things went wrong. It's like, here's the points they were offered. Now those points were half of what was happening.
Right.
And then and I was like, I get it now. For the first time, I actually see like the deal that they made. Yes, the mob ran off with a lot of money, but also it was just not a great deal that was made because they had to keep giving their points away. They had to keep giving their power away in order to make the film get made in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good, there's a lot of that weirdness of, you could look at it as naivete, and you can look at it as, you know, I think Hooper described himself as the shortest Texan you'll ever meet, right? Because he was just this diminutive guy. And there is this thing that he kind of got pushed around, especially by the mobsters, no doubt. And so there was this thing of like, I'm going to make this movie. Nobody wants to make this movie. They're going to give me this small amount of money. And to get it done, he had to shed flesh, right? And a lot of that he shed other people's flesh without knowing it or knowing it, and
without consent.
without consent, right? And so it's really interesting hearing Bozeman going, oh yeah, so many of these things. It's kind of like Romero changing the name to Night of the Living Dead and forgetting about the copyright C, right? And that changes everything, and it becomes public domain, and this huge embarrassment. It's just a naive mistake. A moment of early filmmaking where you don't realize how many ways people can fuck you, and that happens with the money, and it soured so many people's memories. Like, yeah, they made me fall down a flight of stairs, or I had to jump out of a house 40 fucking times, but at least I got a paycheck out of it. They didn't even get that because of this shitty ass deal. So yeah, you're right on that. I really loved the documentary, or not the documentary, but the conversation between Friedkin and Hooper, because they are so different in the way that they talk. Their bombast is different. And yet there's this appreciation that's happening when they're talking. And there's a moment where Hooper says something like, yeah, everybody hated me on the set, were alienated. And Friedkin goes, yeah, I can relate. And he just kind of leans back, and everybody laughs. There is something I have a love-hate relationship with that kind of thing. Like, I dislike the idea of abuse of anybody for something as simple as making a movie. And I hate difficult arguments, but I seem to be drawn to the guys who create difficult arguments and difficult films. And so seeing these two guys that I can sometimes really, like, I can get really upset around Friedkin because some of the things that he did helped allow people to do things like that for decades, because he was important and he got an Oscar for it. And yet I'm fascinated by him, down to the failures that he made. And I'm fascinated with Hooper in the same fashion. And I think there was something there in that conversation where you saw a real camaraderie. And it also showed a gratitude that Hooper has. Like, one of the things that you have through this whole thing, he made all these terrible bits, and I think Aaron had mentioned it before. Nobody is like, if I ever see him, I'm going to break his fucking neck. He's lucky he's living somewhere in an apartment in LA. There's never that, you know. And if people like what's her name, I can't remember, Stretch from the second film. I can't remember her name all of a sudden.
Caroline Williams.
Caroline Williams.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Caroline Williams. She was like, I have an autistic child, and I understand Toby because he seems like, now I get it. When I was working with him and I didn't have a kid, I didn't get it, but I think he might be on the spectrum, and that the way he articulates himself is that way. People tend to think of him nicely. That documentary where Mick Garris starts to tear up thinking about him. That he was one of the sweetest guys, one of the nicest guys, but he made this absolutely terrible thing. I felt that gratitude that he had for the audience coming out. He was grateful, and he didn't want to badmouth anybody. And even though Friedkin's trying to goad him, he was touched when Friedkin said how great he was. And then he's like, "Is this art? Is this art?" And he's like, "Well, I don't want to, and he's like, "Is this art?" Fuck yes, it's art. And it's like, thank you. Of course it's art. And what I think is so great about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is that it's pure cinema. There's so little important dialogue in that film, like really. And so much of this is show me what's going on. And you don't even show in a lineal fashion of what you expect a story to go. I mean, she escapes the house twice. That's like insane. That's like if you're a child telling a story and the giant came back, I guess, because he came and ate the homework again, it's like, it's that kind of thing. And yet it works. And visually you're in a nightmare and you get it so viscerally. And I love that he even stole the bed spring sound from The Exorcist for the chicken cage, and Friedkin caught it. He goes, "I know you used the Foley work that was from there." So I really appreciated that. Two guys, I mean, one's long gone now, 2017, but he felt very alive then. And I saw a guy that, like Bates, I would never hurt a fly, right? So you get this feeling that this guy is absolutely not the kind of guy who would take a bunch of people and put them in 106-degree heat with dead meat and talk behind their backs and not let them sleep for 24 hours. It doesn't seem like that guy, and yet we know he did.
He's absolutely that guy.
More than anybody else.
So we're just about at time. I'd just like to do a quick, run around. Any final thoughts on the movie, on the documentary, on the releases, anything like that, and then we'll just wrap it up. John?
I'd just say, getting back to the acting, just real quick. I don't think Jim Seidel as the cook gets a lot of the credit, because you have Leatherface and the hitchhiker that are obviously batshit crazy, and then you have the teenagers, which are the sane ones. The cook is on both sides, and he switches back and forth. And it's a great performance where he is sympathetic and doesn't want to do this, but then the insanity side goes over and he gets that devilish grin. And even that one scene, which in the pickup truck when he's driving back home, the lighting is unbelievable because it's just the dash light, and he's calming her down, and all of a sudden he's got that grin and he's poking her with the broomstick. I think it's just brilliance of what he does, because he's the only one that plays both sides. So it's another thing to watch, even though you might have seen it 100 times. When you go back and pay a little bit closer attention to the acting, watch him, because he is so much fun to watch.
Oh, yeah. Aaron?
To John's point, I think that watching Jim Seidel perform in this was meaningful to me, because it is exactly the way I watched a horror film when I was 8. That scene whenever they're trying to bang her on that, Grandpa hit that bitch, Grandpa, and you see Jim Seidel and he runs into the kitchen because he can't stand to be in the room, and then he can't stand not to be in the room. So that is exactly the way that I watched horror movies when I was a little kid. I literally stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room, and I would lean in because I couldn't stand not to be in there, and then I'd run away because I couldn't stand to see it. So that was something I picked up on only recently, because so much of what's happening in that sequence is right there in the front. this movie feels very personal to me on a variety of levels. The activities, it says at the beginning, what happened on August 18th, 1973. I was born on August 9th, 1973. So this happened. I was 9 days old, which of course 9 times 2 is 18. The sequence, they were shooting at night, according to Gunnar Hansen and other people's memories, whenever I was born. So I was literally born at 2 a.m. while they were shooting the sequence where they were running around. It's always had a lot of meaning for me after I got over not liking it so much. And so the fact that Dark Sky has kind of put out, there was the edition that I have, then the 40th anniversary deluxe set, and then another Dark Sky edition that they put out, I think, between this one and that one, and then this one. And the fact that they just keep adding little bits to it, I'm going to have all of them. It's worth it to me to keep adding. The cultural legacy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in my opinion, is matched by very, very few other films. And when we're talking about the kinds of horror films that match its legacy, we're talking about Frankenstein. We're talking about Psycho. I mean, it lives on the Mount Rushmore of horror to me. And so this absolutely is a purchase that every horror fan should make. I'm getting no money from Dark Sky, by the way, but I really think it's worth having. And the only reason I don't have it yet is that they got sold out of the original one, and all they have left is the Steelbook. So I've been benefiting from the kindness of AC on having the extras that I could watch. But I'm 100% excited to get a copy myself, and then this will probably be what spurs me to finally go buy a 4K TV.
It was what I have a 4K player because of this movie.
I love the hitchhiker in the van where he takes this picture. This is how, instead of saying, do you want a cigarette to become a friend? You got a match, that old thing. Instead, he's like taking a picture and he's talking about this stuff. And he's like, here, it's $1. And like, fuck you, $1. So he can't just take it back. He has to set it on fire in front of him. That's a mindset, right? That's a certain type of person that I grew up with that has this thing of resentment. And there's so much energy in that. And so I am constantly digging into this movie, trying to find out where some of these ideas came from. I come back to it all the time, assuming that it's not going to have that power anymore. And then I can watch the intro on the DVD, just the splash page that comes up and go, oh, fuck. I remember what this is going to be like. And it's very few films that do that for me. There are many films that I appreciate and that I love, but Chainsaw is very rare air. It decided to tell a story that was super unusual and super uncomfortable and takes us away from formality completely.
Yeah. And I think, kind of circling back around to Toby's idea of it being a very bad day, we get to watch Leatherface. I think that's the thing. We do actually get to relate to every single one of these characters. Should you choose to lean in and have that moment with Leatherface by the window? Should you choose to have that moment with the hitchhiker, where you're like, okay, like there is humanity in every single one of these. None of them is just like a monolith of evil or good. Like everybody in this movie is flawed. And so everybody's kind of bad day results in our good day as horror fans, because we get a movie that is kind of extraordinary and continues to, we continue to mull it over and think about it. And as Scott said, explore. I read Gunnar Hansen's Chainsaw Confidential in prep for this. And you kind of go, wow, there's so much more. You think from at this point, you'd heard everything about a 50-year-old film. And the truth is, A, you haven't heard everything, and B, you haven't experienced everything that you're going to experience when you watch it. I watched it 3 times this week, 2 with commentary, one just on its own last night. And I keep getting new things from it. And that's pretty exceptional. Everybody keep exploring, keep searching, and keep sharing the scare.